Well, okay. So we are recording. I want to share with you today a wonderful topic. I was amazed to discover it. And I think that the topic is also extremely significant and one that's really important to understand in order to study the ancient history of philosophy and religion across Southern Asia, really nothing less than that. So let's get let's get to that. I want to then talk today. This will come up. Please, there it is. Gandahara, or also this region sometimes known as Bactria. These are Greco-Buddhist kingdoms of the Silk Road. Greco-Buddhist kingdoms with, let me get that up. These are kingdoms that existed in the late first millennium, roughly during Hellenic times. And I'm going to explain to you what that means, and you'll see why they existed during Hellenic times, which is not random. So the first thing to understand is the Silk Road. The Silk Road, of course, not just one road, but the Silk Road was a vast network of roads that existed for a long, long time, as far back as the second millennium. And in fact, it's clear that before the Bronze Age collapse in 1200 BCE, you already at that point had trade routes which were sufficient to carry goods from China all the way out to the Mediterranean. So there was active trade on the Silk Road. By the time of the Alexandrian conquest that we're going to look at next, the Silk Road had been there for a long time. Technically speaking, the Silk Road includes what's called a steppe route, which is the route to the north of the Himalayas across sort of southern Siberia. The main route, though, several different paths, as I say, snaking through the Himalayas. And then there was also sea traffic way, way back before the Europeans started to explore, for example, the Indian Ocean basin. There was plenty of ocean-going trade traffic back in the first millennium. So you've got this Silk Road, and then what happens is that King Ashoka, remember, is proselytizing Buddhism as far as he can go, and he does it far and wide, and along the Silk Road exists. So we find the spread of Buddhism along the Silk Road. We find the spread of a lot of different ideas and philosophies along the Silk Road over the centuries. So we get then this Western Buddhist culture. It's Western relative, that is, to India, in the area of what are now Afghanistan and Pakistan. Afghanistan, of course, bordering Iran. So these are coming up to the Persian Empire. King Ashoka, that is, put up his Dharma rocks as far as the boundaries with the Persian Empire to the west. You're just looking at the Silk Road, and I liked this graphic because it gives you some idea of some of the things that were traded along it. The Silk Road was always about money, but notice with this trade also comes lots of culture, lots of information. A big theme, I think, that's taking modern scholarship some time to get used to is the idea that actually the ancient world turns out to be a lot more interconnected than we thought that it was. So the first piece of the puzzle then is King Ashoka that we've looked at, and he then sent his missionaries out along the Silk Road. So they went out to the west, as far as the Persian Empire and beyond the Persian Empire, because Ashoka had missionaries and people writing back to him out in the Mediterranean during his lifetime. So in 336 BC, then, Alexander, on the death of his father Philip, the king of Macedon, which is a Greek country to the north of the Peloponnesus, the Greek peninsula. And Alexander he was a former student of Aristotle's, by the way, and Alexander had been raised to be a military leader. That was his primary training. And Alexander kind of had this idea that, well, what are we going to do? The same thing we do every night, Pinky, try and take over the world. And he did that. And then, of course, these things always have subtexts. The Persian Empire was already weak and overextended and did not have good leadership under Darius II. And Alexander, on top of that, though, to give Alexander credit, he was an absolutely brilliant military, cavalry, and infantry commander whose battles are still studied to this day. So that's another fun topic. So Alexander led his armies all the way out to India, all the way past the eastern borders of the Persian Empire. And as they say, all of the Persian Empire fell to Alexander. He didn't have to actually cover it all with his army. He beheaded it. And because of Alexander, not only out to the east here, but all around the Mediterranean basin as well, of course, North Africa particularly, you have what's called Hellenization in the Hellenic period. The Hellenic period in European studies, roughly the period from the end of the 4th century, with we have, as I say, Alexander writing out in the 330s, and then from there until the rise of the Caesars in the 1st century, before the Common Era. So you've got the Greeks pushing from the west, they're pushing east, and you've got the Buddhism pushing west from the east, and they come together into this period, and you get these Greco-Buddhist kingdoms who, as they say, exist simultaneously. They come up during this Hellenic period at the end of the 1st millennium, and then they exist well into the 1st millennium of the Common Era. In fact, they coincide with the Roman Empire pretty completely, the Roman Empire, which lasts until about the 5th or 6th centuries before you start to say that that was the Byzantine Empire. So here's the Alexandrian conquest. Again, Alexander in his 20s takes over from his father and decides that he's going to conquer the world. In fact, Alexander's soldiers finally made him stop and go back, and he didn't live to get back to Macedon, but he just was going to go on. It was obvious to everyone else that they would all die, but he didn't care. He just wanted to see what would happen. So as you see, he conquered a very vast area and spread Greek culture and Greek language. That's the takeaway, right? Throughout this area. That's why it's important. Among other things, there were the gymnosophists, who were these naked philosophers, so they were called, and there was a delegation of philosophers, Greek philosophers, who went out with Alexander, who rode with Alexander and got out to India with Alexander, where they met with these Buddhists and Hindu. We're not exactly obviously sure exactly what they were. People, mendicants, and ideas were exchanged. So this was not just a gradual thing, but in fact there was exchange of ideas by if you will, professional philosophers, both from the Indian end of things and the Greek end of things at the time. So right now, actually, today, the beginning of the 21st century, we're seeing a number of books being published questioning this idea that there's such a big separation. And to me, working on the Republic a lot these days, it looks real Buddhist to me. But anyway, I digress. About a century before the time of Christ, then, and those in the colored areas in the middle there are Indo-Greek. So you've got the Greek influence and the Indian influence. So let's look at some of it then. I mean, this is the fun part. The fun part is seeing the artifacts, not just an abstraction. You can study the art of Gandahara. And that's, in fact, what jazzes people about it the most, because the extraordinary thing is to see this mix of Buddhist and classical Buddhist and classical Greek elements coexisting in one culture. These folded drapes that you see there carved into the rock, might be marble, might be some other kind of rock, are very characteristic of Greeks. And in fact, enough so that most art historians think that some of these standing Buddhists, also notice the Buddhist freestanding figure, right? And naturalism, and then some of these stylistic things with the carving. You see the similarity there. Oh gosh, is it even the same? No, it's different. But carved by, if not the same artist, someone very similar. Here's Hercules as Vajrapani. Vajrapani is the protector of the Buddha. He's Buddha's muscle, basically. It goes in the legends and the stories. And you see in Hercules' left hand, there is the omphalos, which was fed to his father, the Titan, so that he would not kill him, and trying to avoid the prophecy, the stone at the middle of the world. And that's out of Greek mythology. Here's a Greek coin. If you look at the left side, you can see that unmistakable Greek language, the ancient Greek that you would learn if you were learning to study Greek, to study philosophy. On the other side, we have Bodo, again, a Greek idiomatic script meaning Buddha. So here are Greek-speaking, Greek-writing people who are making coins with the Buddha on it. We ought to use our imagination. A blue-eyed Central Asian monk, blue-eyed, right? I mean, so, and if you go to Afghanistan, you have a lot of blue-eyed, green-eyed people. And again, this is this Caucasian, in the technical sense of that word, that Aryan influence. Bodhidharma is a legendary Buddhist monk who brought the sutras to China. So in the second semester of Asian studies, we talk about the introduction of Buddhism into China, and one of the legends is that Bodhidharma brought the Lankavatara Sutra into China in the early first millennium of the Common Era, maybe around 4th century or so. And so there are two basic theories about who Bodhidharma might have been, and one is that he's one of these far Western sort of Caucasian influenced Buddhists. And sometimes people will even tell you that that's a picture of Bodhidharma, although they don't know that. So Ashoka stones, right? And you know about the Rosetta Stone, where you've got 3 different languages piled on top of each other by the pharaoh, helping us understand hieroglyphics, Demotic Egyptian, and then the bottom was ancient Greek. Ancient Greek, the same Attic Greek, Attic being the sort of municipio of Athens, being the same thing that you see here on the top, Aramaic, the language of the Persian Empire. And so this was a rock and Ashoka stone from the far west. You put up right up by the boundaries of the Persian Empire, where Ashoka's missionaries figured it might be seen by Aramaic and Greek reading people. A big part of understanding, excuse me, ancient Greek art history are the columns, because the columns are functional parts of their architecture and they're all over the place. And each city had its own column, and particularly the capital, which is the top of the column, the part of the column that connects the column to the roof that it's holding up. And there would be distinctive designs. So you hear people talk about, Ionic columns and Doric columns. And here is one that's recognizably Corinthian. I suppose that's going to do with those kind of flying buttress things. But the thing about this one is it's got a Buddha on it. So you have an artist almost certainly from Corinth, a artisan making these columns on a building or a temple somewhere out in Central Asia. And so he's Corinthian trained, and he's putting Buddhas on his capitals, on the top of all his columns. So there was a Greek-looking temple that had Buddhas on all the capitals of the columns along the side of it at one time. Now, this is again looking later. You got 1st century CE, the Common Era, right? Notice Rome isn't on this, but you can see the Greek lands, and you can see the extent of Christianity there coming up in that 1st century. That's the time of the Christianization of Rome. Then you'll get the Christian emperors in the next century. But look at the extent of Buddhism at that time. Buddhism just very far. Can I even move my little picture? Am I just stuck with that? I can move it anywhere to that. Okay. So let's put it up here. Why not? That's a good place for it. I love it. But look at the extent of Buddhism there. Buddhism that is at its highest extent at the beginning of the 1st millennium and in India. And then Buddhism really doesn't exist in India by uh, earlier than you'd think, about the 5th or 6th century of the first millennium. Then after the Mughal invasions, Buddhism is basically gone from India. Oh, yeah. Okie dokie. So, so a fascinating subject, mostly approached in terms of art history. I also suggested, though, here today that it is significant in terms of philosophy and religious studies as well, because in our old school provinciality, us being human beings in general, I think, or human scholars in general, I think we have always greatly underestimated the extent of the sharing of ideas that we can clearly see very strongly in terms of Buddhist ideas and Platonic and Christian ideas. And I think that's very significant. But as I say, you have something that's mostly of significance to art historians, because we have this fascinating, I only showed you a few examples, a fascinating trove of Greco-Buddhist artifacts of all things. So if you're somebody like me who loves ancient Greek stuff and you love Buddhist stuff, then finding out about the Greco-Buddhist kingdoms, it's like too much. So anyway, that's a fun thing to share with you, and I'll give you some links so you can study that a little bit more. Okay. I shall see you anon.